Thank you very, very much, Professor Diaz. I am absolutely delighted to be here, and it's been a long time. Professor Diaz and I met in New York City, I think more than 20 years ago at New York University, and then again several years later, and it was a very, very memorable and wonderful opportunity to get to know each other. So I really want to thank you for this beautiful invitation, and also to congratulate you and your colleagues on developing this PhD program, which is a very, very special opportunity. I hope those of you who are in the program really realize and appreciate what a wonderful opportunity it is. Tonight, my topic is Materializing History, Time and Telos in Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And I will try to explain what I mean by those terms as we go along. It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it, and rare too when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward. Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of Polin Museum. This is a statement that was written shortly after October 28th in 2014, which was the grand opening of this museum, which coincided with the opening of the core exhibition. And it was written by the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Now this is where we have created this museum. We have literally created this Museum of the History of Polish Jews in the place that was once home to the largest Jewish community, a place where they once lived, and the place where they died. We are creating this museum, and we have created this museum on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was also the pre-war Jewish neighborhood in Warsaw, where the largest Jewish community in Europe and for a period in the world once lived. And the rubble of the ghetto was cleared only after decades of effort. It was a mountain of rubble. And in 1948, on the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there was the unveiling of the monument to the ghetto heroes on the rubble, and you can see that at the very, very top. And that monument marked the place in Warsaw where one would go if one wanted to honor those who died, and one would remember how they died. And the monument has two sides. On one side are the fighters, the active resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and on the other side is the image of the Great Deportation. And when it was decided to create a museum of the history of Polish Jews, the city of Warsaw allocated the area in orange, and you can see to the left of it the monument. Now, in the period when the monument was unveiled in 1948, 5 years after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, that monument was monumental on that mountain of rubble. But you can imagine today, as monuments go, it isn't monumental in the way that, say, the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe is, for example, in Berlin. And so the area, that orange area, is an area in a plaza and a park that was left empty as the communist-era apartment blocks were built. You can imagine the housing shortage in a destroyed city. After the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, 80% of the city of Warsaw had been destroyed by the Germans. So when you've got a big city, 80% of it destroyed, you can imagine the kind of crisis that it represented for the population of the city. Now, the idea for this museum arose in 1993, 4 years after the fall of communism, which is pretty extraordinary. And it was inspired by the opening of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And the thought was that if there's a Holocaust museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Poland. The last thing Poland needed was a Holocaust museum. In a sense, the entire country was already a Holocaust museum because the Germans had built all the death camps in occupied Poland. And it was in occupied Poland in those death camps where 3 million Polish Jews perished and where another 3 million European Jews were brought and killed. And so the story of the lives that these people lived for 1,000 years in this territory had been understandably completely overshadowed by the genocide. And the idea that the task of memory wasn't complete if one remembered only how people died, that one needed to also remember how they lived. And in the case of Poland, how they had lived in the same territory for 1,000 years, which is not the case in the rest of Europe. Not in Spain, not in Portugal, not in England, not Germany, not France, not Austria, not parts of Italy. So this continuous presence for 1,000 years is an extraordinary story, and it was a story that was lost with those who perished. Not only did they perish, but the world they created was destroyed with them, and the memory of that world was also lost. And so the recovery of that history is a moral obligation. And to do so on this site is a very, very powerful thing to do. And I say that because when we were first working on the project, and I would present this, for example, in the United States or in Canada, and especially to Jewish communities, the first question was, why are you creating this museum in Poland? And I said, well, you don't ask that about the Jewish Museum in London or in Philadelphia or anywhere else. Well, they said there are no Jews in Poland. I said, well, not exactly. There are Jews in Poland, but they said, you should make it in New York or you should make it in Tel Aviv. Well, the power of this museum is really connected to the place in which it is set. It is a site-specific museum, and the power of telling the story in the very place where it happened is incomparable. And so, between 1993 and 2005, there was an idea, and there was a project, and it was initiated not by the city of Warsaw, not by the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage. It was initiated by a Jewish NGO, a little non-profit organization that was established just after the war in Poland, in Warsaw, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. And that little NGO, which had never made a museum, had never made a major exhibition, had never raised a lot of money, were very idealistic and unrealistic, which is the only way such a museum could ever have been created. Anybody realistic would have said from the outset, it's not possible, it's unrealistic, and I have no idea what the outcome would have been. So the idea that this was a civic initiative 4 years after the fall of communism, coming from an NGO, and who carried the project when nobody believed that it could be realized until 2005. Now, what did they do between 1993 and 2005? They worked on the story. They didn't have a collection. They didn't have an historic building. They had rubble. And what they did is they said, we have the story, and it's our task to tell that story in a compelling way, and to tell it in the form of a multimedia narrative exhibition. And that is precisely the work that they did between 93 and 2005, was to prepare the master plan for the core exhibition. In 2005, with the master plan in hand, the association went to the city of Warsaw and the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage and formed a unique private-public partnership for a cultural institution in Poland. It's a very, very unusual partnership. Most museums in Europe, most museums in Poland are in fact state museums, state-initiated, state-funded, state-run, state museums. So this is really a very, very unusual situation. And the division of labor was that the public partners would pay for the building and they would oversee its construction. And the private partner, the NGO, the association, they would make the exhibition, they would tell the story, and they would raise the money for it. Unprecedented. But what that meant was that the story was not being told by the state. And this is critically, critically important. Now, in 2005, when the agreement was signed to form the museum, there was the first successful international architectural competition for a public building in Poland. And the building that we got, I think, is absolutely perfect for this museum. It is much, much better in reality, and certainly as a built museum, even from photographs, better than the drawings that I saw. And it's really incredibly appropriate. So the first is that it should stand in a respectful relationship to the monument. Now, clearly, the monument, which was, as I said, quite monumental in its time, is very easily overshadowed by a very dramatic building. And so the winner of the competition, there were 250 more or less entries, 11 finalists were invited to submit more detailed plans, and the winner is a Finnish architect, Rainer Mahlamäki. And I think to myself, only a Scandinavian could have been modest enough to have created this minimalist exterior clad in glass. Now, to create a glass building on a site of genocide is a message of hope in the face of tragedy, is how I see this building. The message of this beautiful glass building is that it's openness, reflection, light, transparency, and that's the message of what is inside in terms of the exhibition and the programming. And so here you can see more clearly the way in which the building itself echoes the geometry of the monument. The monument is granite, it's dark, it's very, I would say, it's much more connected to the message of the Holocaust, but the building is much more connected to the 1,000-year story of Jewish life. Inscribed on the glass, they're like scales on a fish. Inscribed on these glass panels in Hebrew letters and in Latin letters is the word Polin. And this is where our intangible heritage story starts. And that is, it starts with a legend. It starts with a legend the Jews told themselves about how they came to Poland and why they stayed. And it's an act of historical imagination. You have to imagine Jews living in Poland for 1,000 years, and at some moment, whether it's in the 19th century or the early 20th century, a kind of act of imagination of how did we get here in what I would call time before time. And the story goes something like this, that Jews were persecuted in Western Europe, they fled east, they found themselves in a forest, and they heard the word Polin, which they understood, first of all, it's the Hebrew word and the Yiddish word for Poland, which they understood as Polin, rest here, here you shall rest. And the legend varies. The clouds broke, an angel's hand pointed, Polin, or the birds chirped Polin, or pages of sacred text floated down, or Hebrew words are carved on the trees. And that's the starting point. That is, and you'll see in a moment how we communicate that in the exhibition. So the starting point is a legend. The starting point is not an object, it's a legend. And so that the name of the museum is taken from that legend, and the term Polin is inscribed on the glass exterior. And you can see also that the element of glass, which is really important, is there also on the interior, which is where all the drama is. The drama is on the interior. That is to say, warm, organic forms, completely in contrast with the exterior. Now, the entrance to the exhibition, to the core exhibition, is from the Great Hall, from the main floor, from inside this beautiful, beautiful building, where the treatment it's a technique called shotcrete. It's concrete, quartz crystals, and sandstone that is shot out of a hose onto netting that's on an armature. So it's a very special technique. Otherwise, we could never get these incredible curved forms. And so we enter, and you can see that the monument is somewhat visible from inside the building, but doesn't dominate. And then we enter the core exhibition. Now, what kind of an exhibition is it? Now, basically, we started without a collection. We formed a collection specifically for the exhibition. But as you will see, we were not, even if we had a collection, this is what the collection would look like. This is an extremely important collection of objects at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. They have about 15,000 objects. They have a very important archive and library. But what kind of objects are available? They are largely paintings from the 19th and 20th century. They are Judaica, silver, ornaments from the Torah scroll, synagogue objects. There's some documents, some medals. Basically, not material from which you can craft a compelling 1,000-year story. Even if we had access to every collection in the world, private collection, public collection, objects alone are not adequate to the story that we want to tell and not adequate to the way in which we want to tell the story. That said, we would use many more objects if we could have gotten them and they could have supported the narrative. So what we did instead is we created what I call a theater of history. We created a theater of history. And what that means is that we do present objects, but for an exhibition of this size, it's 4,200 square meters. So for an exhibition of this size, you would expect more than 200 objects. 200 objects is nothing in an exhibition of this size. But we use them very strategically, and they're extremely interesting, but that's relatively few. But for us, we started from the story, not from a collection. Now, the director of the Jewish Museum in London came to see our exhibition, went back to London, and wrote an article in the Jewish Chronicle. Jewish Chronicle is the most important Jewish newspaper in England, in the UK. And the headline was, "An Empty Museum." Now, when you see this exhibition, when I show you this exhibition, you'll see, number one, hardly empty. And I have to tell you that in 2 weeks, we're making a flash mob, it's our entire staff, to welcome our 1 millionth visitor. So hardly an empty museum. So then I've heard from other museum directors and curators that are working in museums that have huge collections, and they say, you know how lucky you are you don't have a collection? Because they are obliged to show their collection and to create almost everything they do from their collection. And that turns out to be a mixed blessing. It is, in a sense, it's a blessing on the one hand and it's a curse on the other. And so depending on how you look at it, we're in a good position. I actually think we're in a very good position. And as we acquire more objects and present them, hopefully in an even better position. So a theater of history. And what does that mean? It means that we've created a continuous visual narrative where we lead with intangible heritage. And this is absolutely critical. And that is to say that rather from starting from objects and figuring out how we can use them to tell the story, we start from the story, and we start from, if you will, I'm going to show you some examples, but essentially, our approach is to create a theater of history in which we materialize intangible heritage. That's our fundamental approach. So it means that it's about voices, and it's about the ways in which people lived, thought, spoke, felt, and acted. And that is something we can get to through autobiographies, memoirs, chronicles, through a whole range of material. So, and I'll show you some examples. So theater of history, and that means that we work scenographically. That doesn't mean period rooms. We never do anything like a literal recreation of anything. And we, in fact, have created a new kind of object from my point of view, and I'll be interested in what you think about it. So it's a theater of history. Now, how do we make the exhibition? During the 1990s and basically the late 1990s, the team, which was led by Jerzy Halberstadt, who led the project for about 15 years, and I consider him to really be the visionary whose vision this project realizes. So he established an historical team. They developed an outline of the historical program, a database, essentially of scans and photographs of every conceivable document, photograph, whatever could be useful, and together with a design company in London called Event Communications, created the master plan. And interestingly, the master plan, you can see sort of schematically, and this was before we knew what building we would have. So the master plan was created in a way that would show how the historical narrative in the outline could be expressed in an exhibition. And the first task, when I was asked to lead the project of developing the exhibition in 2006, was to review and assess the master plan. And we did, and I can come back to how we changed the overall outline, but first what I'd like to do is to convey to you the general principles that we used, because these principles go to my other topics, which are time and telos. So what are the principles that we used? I like to say that we don't have a master narrative. And I can assure you state museums and museums of national histories generally have a master narrative. There will be a Museum of Polish History. I'm pretty confident it will have a master narrative. So we don't have, at least we don't want to have a master narrative, but Professor Moshe Rossman, a wonderful historian of the early modern period of Polish Jews, he said, okay, You don't have a master narrative, but you have meta-historical principles. In other words, you have some guiding ideas. So what are the guiding ideas? And this really is absolutely critical to my way of thinking, to the impact that this exhibition and this museum can have. So I've often been asked, what is the most important period in the history of Polish Jews? And the answer, first of all, the people who ask, almost invariably, they know the answer. So for some, it's the Holocaust. For others, it's the post-war years, because that's the period in which they grew up and lived and that they know intimately and that they feel. For others, it's the interwar years, the period of their parents, grandparents. Nobody says the Middle Ages, which is almost 600 years, more than half of our 1,000-year story. Nobody says the Middle Ages, which turns out to be absolutely fascinating. And my answer is always one and the same. The most important period in the history of Polish Jews is 1,000 years, all of it. That's the message, that this is a 1,000-year story, not a 4-year story, not a 20th century story. It is about 1,000 years of continuous presence in this place. That's the first meta-historical principle. And as a result, when we were delayed in opening, there was a suggestion we should open a gallery at a time. And I said, no way. It's all or nothing. And that's because of the principle of 1,000 years. Then, Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland. They're not only in Poland, but they're also of Poland. And this actually goes to how we changed that diagram that I showed you earlier. In other words, what we try to avoid is what I would call a contextual history, in which first you somehow draw, for example, that earlier diagram shows that there would be 3 lines. One would be something called the Polish and European timeline. Then there was a Jewish line, and then there were these trans-historical thematic areas. That was the first thing that we rejected, because what we didn't want to do was to create something called a context and then put Jews into the picture. So our intention in the narration and in the construction of the exhibition was to provide an integrated and integral history in which we could communicate that Jews were not only in Poland but also of Poland, and that the history of Poland is not complete without the history of Polish Jews, that they are an integral part of that history. And in fact, some of our Polish visitors, when they leave, they say with somewhat surprised and also, I would say, appreciative, they say, you know, this is a museum of Polish history. But the idea that they would recognize this history as a history of Poland and as a museum of Polish history, that's a major, major achievement. And I think that this is exactly what we were after. This is a story of coexistence and conflict, cooperation and competition, separation and integration, and on either side of that set of binaries, sometimes one is dominant and the other is less, other is dominant, the other is less. But this is extremely important because we present a spectrum of relations. Now, why is that so important, and why is the 1,000-year story so important? Because there are probably more Holocaust museums, Holocaust centers, and Holocaust exhibitions than there are museums of Jewish history, or even Jewish museums. And because in those museums, the Holocaust is situated within a 1,000-year history of anti-Semitism. And if there is anything about Jewish life before, let alone after, because usually the Holocaust is treated as closing the book, and there is no after, but if there's anything before, it's usually some very small, pre-war period kind of acknowledgement. And so when you situate the Holocaust within a history of anti-Semitism, it's a very different story from when you situate the Holocaust within a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, and which is not a 1,000-year history of unmitigated anti-Semitism. This country became home to the largest Jewish community in the world, and it became a center of the Jewish world, and it became the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world. And that doesn't happen if you have an unmitigated history of anti-Semitism, which is a kind of stain and a stigma that has attached itself to Poland in a way that has, if you will, made it even more important to tell the story that we tell as a spectrum of relations and a full story of the best and also the worst. That Jews in Poland created a civilization that is categorically Jewish and distinctly Polish, and we have some wonderful examples that I will show you. That Polish Jews became the largest Jewish community in the world, the power of telling the story in the very place where it happened, and that we are a site of conscience. Now, what does that mean? It means that one of our primary objectives is to create a trusted zone, that is to say, a zone of trust within which our visitors, all of them, Jewish visitors, Polish visitors, international visitors, will be open and better prepared to engage with extremely difficult subjects, which until now, at least in the Polish context, but also elsewhere, have been very polarizing and very polarized. And so what we would like to do is to create a very different situation, a situation that I call constructive engagement. So now, what do we do with that legend? That where we start with the intangible heritage of a legend. What we did is we started with a forest. And the forest is based on a film that is evocative of the UNESCO heritage forest of one of the last wilderness forests in the northeast of Poland. And it's in this, if you will, intended to be, it may be a little less than what we intended to be immersive and very poetic forest, is how we begin the 1,000-year story. We actually start it with a story that Jews told themselves. And then what we do is we move, we move to the, if you will, we cross the threshold between legend and history as we enter the medieval gallery. Now, the medieval gallery, 965 until 1507. What is there by way of objects to tell this almost 600-year story? 965 to 1507. And we're talking here about objects that relate directly and specifically to this territory and to Jews in this territory. There are in the world, fundamentally, basically, two kinds of objects. One, coins, bracteates, one-sided coins, and some of them have Hebrew inscriptions, which means that Jews were obviously involved in minting, whether they were supervising minting, whether they were minting themselves. And the second, tombstones. The coins are the size of a penny, and some of them are indecipherable. And the tombstones, I'm not going to make a cemetery. So you can imagine, you've got almost 600 years, and you've got tombstones and coins. And we have a coin. It's the most expensive and oldest object in our modest collection. And that coin looks like a piece of chewing gum. It's so tiny and so indecipherable that in terms of getting the value from it, you have to do something besides show it. And that's precisely what we do. And so given that we have this huge story to tell, it's a story fundamentally of how a few traveling merchants from Western Europe, traveling along international trade routes that ran through Poland, from those few traveling merchants, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, do we get to a point in 1507 where the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world is shifting from the Rhineland and from Western Europe to this territory. How did that happen? That's fundamentally the story of the medieval gallery. And we begin with Ibrahim ibn Yaqub. Now, Polish high school students who learn history, who study Polish history, they until recently, at least until our museum, only knew, there was only two moments in their history studies where they encountered Jews. One was Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, and the other is Holocaust. Now, hopefully, between the two, there's going to be a lot more that they will know, having visited our museum and having worked with our educators. Now, why Ibrahim ibn Yaqub? Ibrahim ibn Yaqub was a Jew from Cordoba who was sent by the Caliph on a diplomatic mission across Europe. And he wrote an incredibly important travel account. And although the original travel account hasn't survived, it has been quoted so many times by others that we know it from later, like somewhat later, accounts. And of course, he wrote it in Arabic. Of course, our visitors are quite shocked that one of the first quotations they discover in our 1,000-year story, well, the first two are in Hebrew and the next one's in Arabic. And so that's a good conversation starter. Now, they know him because his account is the first extant account to describe Poland. That's how come they know him. And generally, they do know that he was Jewish, maybe not always, but they generally know. And so the very first principle in our, if you will, way of working with intangible heritage is through quotations from primary sources. In other words, one of our principles is that this should be a multi-voiced narrative and that it should be told in the words of those whose story we are telling. And when we do so, and we have it as a big quote, we quote in the original language, we use a font from the period, and we translate into Polish and English, which are our languages of communication. And what that means is that there are maybe 10 or more languages that appear graphically in the whole exhibition. Hebrew, Yiddish, Polish, Latin, Arabic, Russian, German, French, Czech. I've got at least nine languages, which is a message about, if you will, the diverse nature of this story from the beginning all the way to much lesser extent, all the way to the present, but to a much lesser extent. And so we start then with a fundamental principle, which is to narrate in the present moment, in the historical present. And the historical present is our time. And why is it critically important to narrate in the historical present from sources of that moment and in the words of those whose story we're telling? And this goes to the issue of telos, because one of the things we ask our visitors to do is to bracket what they know about what happened later, not to look forward, not to foreshadow, and not to look back, and especially not to look back through the lens of the Holocaust. In other words, we are doing everything we can to pull back from the teleological drive of this story, which for many visitors coming, or most visitors coming to this museum, the one thing that is, if you will, most dominant in their thinking, and the one thing they know is the Holocaust. And it's very important for us that the Holocaust not determine this 1,000-year story, that it not become the inevitable endpoint. If you start with hate, the logical telos of hate is genocide. But we don't start with hate, and we don't end with hate, and the telos, if you will, of our story is not genocide. Genocide happened. It was all-defining, absolutely catastrophic, but we cannot construct a 1,000-year story in a way that would, if you will, be seen primarily through the lens of the Holocaust. And so, as a result, we narrate in the historical present, and we narrate through sources that are from the period. And we have been extremely, extremely disciplined, and it becomes extremely important in the interwar years, and especially in the Holocaust Gallery, but not only. Now, what we're very interested in doing is, in a sense, quite anthropological, in the best sense of the word, because I have to tell you that and this was one of our early and very important donors, when I first met him, when I first began on working on the project, I was invited to go out, have a cup of coffee, and it was all very friendly. And then he asked me my field, and I said anthropology. And then he said to me, he said, I know what kind of exhibition this is going to be, teepees and feathers. And I thought to myself, oh my God, teepees and feathers? No way. And what he meant was the Jewish equivalent would be Fiddler on the Roof, or something to do with shtetl. And I'm so allergic to anything of that kind. In fact, I banned my team from using the S word in English, the word shtetl, which in English, it's a Yiddish word which just means town, but in English it means a very particularly, a sort of a Jewish place in a very particular way. And it's very stereotypical, and this entire history has been reduced to it. So, our medieval story then culminates by around 1500, where we are now looking at a place that has begun to become the center of the Ashkenazi Jewish world, Ashkenazi meaning Jews from German-speaking areas of Europe. And we enter the early modern period, the period 1569 to 1772. It's the period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when Poland was, the Commonwealth was one of the very largest countries in Europe, one of the most diverse, and one of the most religiously tolerant in Europe, in large measure because of its sheer diversity. And so here, what we want to do is to try to communicate what made this period, quote, golden, in quotation marks, for Polish Jews. And from a Jewish perspective, what made it golden was completely intangible, namely learning. It was the rise of rabbinical authority, the rise of learning, the rise of Jewish academies, of yeshivas, and Hebrew and Yiddish printing. Now, Hebrew and Yiddish printing, of course, is material, but it's not the material physical book that was valued, but what was inside it. But on the other hand, we try to interest our visitors in a subject that is very inaccessible to them. The 15-year-old Polish boy is our hardship case. So we thought to ourselves, how are we going to interest this 15-year-old Polish boy in a Hebrew textbook on the minute rules of kosher meat, where the first 3 pages are on the salting of meat? That would be really difficult. And so we decided to in a sense, materialize the story by creating printing presses and offering opportunity to actually print printer's marks, title page of one of the most important books. And we intended it for kids, but I have to tell you, adults love it even as much, if not more. And so we also wanted to open the books up, because the point of these books is what's in them and not simply the physical book. The physical book, you can open it, but that's it. And then you can have a little text beside it. But that doesn't do it. We wanted to open those books up, we wanted to make their content available, and we wanted visitors to understand why they were important and why they were interesting. And so we did that using wonderful interactive technologies that allowed us to bring what would otherwise be completely inaccessible material. This is a Kabbalistic scroll that nobody knew where it was. We found it actually in a library in England. And we're able here to give our visitors a chance to explore it in a way that the physical scroll would never, ever allow us to do. Of course, if we had the physical scroll, we would show it as well. The economic story. This economic story, there is almost no iconography from the period for really illustrating it. There are contracts, and what we've done is to work with the language of the contract to try to communicate what the economic relations were and the role of Jews in the rural economy of the Commonwealth. When it comes to the 1648-49, this was, from a Jewish perspective, this was the Khmelnytsky uprising, and from a Jewish perspective, it was a devastating event, absolutely devastating. A third of the Jewish population of what is today Ukraine were killed, and many Jews fled, others were forced to convert. And what we've done here, this is completely animated from an eyewitness account by Natan Hanover, who witnessed this essentially a pogrom, but we don't use that word. We don't use the term before the middle of the 19th century, but essentially this massacre. He narrates it in a book where he includes other eyewitness accounts, and the entire narration is from his account, which means from his experience. And that's not something an object or even the book itself can convey. So this is narrated from that particular eyewitness source, very close to the period. And when we exit from that 1642 area, the Khmelnytsky uprising, we enter an area we call the Jewish town, and it's the period 1648 to 1772. Now, the Jewish town, we call it the Jewish town because Jews settled primarily in towns and cities, but especially in towns. And where they settled, they formed a large proportion of the population. In fact, even a majority of the population. And so this gave these towns a very special character. This pattern is very specific to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and to the countries that became what we know today as Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, the Baltics. And so we wanted to zoom in on everyday life in this very, very unique environment where, because of the critical mass of Jews who lived there, they also created a very, very unique way of life. And so we're probably the only museum of Jewish history that has a church. We're very proud of our church. And it's here that we tell the story of a heretic, Jacob Frank, whose followers considered him a messiah. And it's also here that we created the beautiful, a new kind of object. And this is probably where the idea of materializing the intangible heritage that we work with is most, I would say, powerfully expressed. And so basically, during the period of the Commonwealth in the 17th and 18th centuries, this is the period when the most incredibly beautiful wooden synagogues were created across the length and the breadth of this territory, which is really a big territory. And some of them just died a natural death, that is to say by fire during World War I. But whatever was left standing in 1939 and during the Second World War, the Germans burnt to the ground. Today, there is not one of these great wooden synagogues survived. Not one. And so we worked with a nonprofit educational studio called Hans House Studio in Massachusetts, and they have a great mission statement. Their mission is to recover lost objects. To recover lost objects. They recovered a wooden submarine from the 18th century. They recovered all kinds of interesting objects, but when they found the wooden synagogue, they found the ultimate lost object. And what they say is you can never recover the original object in the sense of the original material, but you can recover the knowledge of how to build it by building it using traditional tools, materials, and techniques. And that's what we did. And what that means is that this is a case where we valued the intangible heritage, the knowledge of how to build it. And that intangible heritage isn't simply something that somebody wrote in a book. It's embodied. It is embodied. And in order to transmit it, you have to embody it with traditional tools, and you have to transmit it in that embodied form. It's not enough to talk it, write it, describe it, photograph it. It's embodied knowledge, and you can recover that embodied knowledge only by doing it. It's basically like performance. It's how dance is transmitted. It's embodied knowledge. The body is the archive. And so what we did is, first of all, we worked, this stage is with timber framers, and the Timber Framers Guild of America worked with us. Now, if you know timber framers, you know that they are, how can I say, they are passionate about timber framing, and there are timber framer organizations in Europe as well. They work with traditional tools. They love this method of construction. And we went to an open-air museum in the south of Poland, just outside of Sanok, and we started with 200 raw logs with the bark still on. And these timber framers arrived with their traditional tools, their adzes, their lathes, their pit saws, all the traditional tools in golf bags, in ski bags, how they got them onto airplanes and through security. And then when they started to work and they taught our volunteers how to use these techniques, it was like Lord of the Rings. They with all these incredible tools. And so in 3 workshops in one summer, we did the timber framing to create the roof and the panels for the painted ceiling. Now, on what basis did we, and I call this a new kind of object. It is not, from my point of view, it is not a copy. It is not a facsimile. It is not a reproduction. It is not a reconstruction. It is not a recreation. It is a new kind of object because it materializes intangible heritage that was recovered from the method by which this was constructed. So even if there was, let me put it this way, we didn't set out to make a replica. We set out to recover the knowledge of how to do it. And the material outcome is the outcome of that process. That is what it means to materialize intangible heritage. That's what it means. And it was an incredibly moving experience because altogether we worked with probably 300 volunteers, maybe more, and with experts. And also, I'll show you in a moment the paintings. Now, on what basis did we do it? This particular synagogue once stood in Gwoździec, a very small town, maybe 1,000, 1,200 people, very small town with a tiny Jewish community, maybe over half the population, but more or less half was Jewish. And this particular synagogue was actually destroyed during World War I when the Russian front moved through Gwoździec. Gwoździec is near Kolomea, not far from Lviv, which is today in Ukraine, but before the war and during the period, the early modern period, it was in the Commonwealth and then in Poland. It just so happens that it's the single best documented of any wooden synagogue. And the documentation started in 1890 with a Polish artist and architectural, if you will, historian, who wrote a dissertation on it by hand, written, with drawings. But then, between 1910 and 1913, Alois Breyer, an architectural historian in Vienna, he made hundreds of photographs, drawings, elevations, floor plans, dimensions, everything imaginable. And so what we did at the end of the summer of the timber framing is that the whole structure is like a puzzle. It's put together with wooden pegs. We pulled out the pegs, we numbered all the parts, we brought all the parts to Warsaw, we put them at the exhibition level, we reassembled it, put the pegs back in, and we hoisted this structure into place. It's 25 tons. And we suspended it from cables. So it's actually floating. So some have said that it's our Sistine Chapel. And I call it a celestial canopy because the effect is unbelievable with this floating, beautiful floating ceiling. And Nelia actually reminded me that, and I've often said, that this is a very Japanese approach. And not that I don't think that Hans House Studio thought of it in those terms, but there is in Japan a shrine, Jingju Shrine, which says of itself that it's 800 years old and never more than 20 years old. Because every 20 years they tear it down in order to have to rebuild it, because the only way to transmit the knowledge of how to do it is by doing it. And so we'd had no choice. There was nothing to tear down, and we wouldn't have torn down a wooden synagogue in order to have to rebuild it. But nonetheless, the approach to value the intangible heritage more than the material from which this building was made, that's the case in Jingju Shrine. And so then we did the painting workshops. What we did is we divided the ceiling into 8 sections, and we went to, I think, 7 different cities to synagogues that are still standing, masonry synagogues that are still standing. And we did a workshop, 2-week workshop to paint a section. This was done in Wrocław in the White Stork Synagogue. This is the section that would go on the eastern wall, the most important wall above the Ark for the Torah scrolls. And these are students. They were supervised by experts and by educators, and they did an incredible job in these painted panels. And the wonderful thing here is it was in our intention, by doing it in this way, to activate local interest in the synagogue of the town and also in the Jewish past of the town, and to take pride in having contributed and been part of the making of the museum itself. Now when visitors come, and sometimes I've been in the exhibition and a visitor will say to me, you know, one of those panels was made in my town in Rzeszów. Which one? And now I have to learn which of those panels was actually painted in which town, which some of them I know. And so basically our multimedia approach is a storytelling approach. It's a narrative approach. There's a big narrative that's multi-voiced, that's told in more than one voice. Some of those voices are in harmony, some of them are dissonant, but it's also an attempt to bring stories alive and to start from narrative, to start from stories. And so when we come to the end of the 18th century, this enormous commonwealth had become a republic of nobles, very decentralized, very weak army, and Russia, Prussia, and Austria divided it up, and we follow the long 19th century in what we call the partitions. That is, the parts of the Commonwealth that became Galicia in the case of Austria, and that came under those empires. We look at everyday life and ways in which it was challenged and transformed by many laws, and in this case, we take the Jewish wedding as a case in point. And of course, we have objects and this is probably where we have the richest objects for trying to show this story, but in fact, the story that we want to tell is much more than the objects themselves. And one very good example of a case where we had absolutely nothing to work with by way of objects or images was in the story of the modern yeshiva. When we tell the story of the 19th century, we tell about what we call encounters with modernity. And these encounters with modernity take many forms. On the one hand, it's an encounter in everyday life, as we show in the wedding, and on the other hand, it takes an organized form, in this case, the creating of a new kind of Jewish academy, the modern yeshiva. And when I first heard about it, I thought to myself, you know, this really sounds boring. Where's the material? And my historians told me there are no photographs, no paintings, no drawings, no prints, no nothing. And this is a very important story. And so what we did is we found wonderful memoirs and autobiographies and first-person accounts of those who were students in this modern yeshiva or who visited it. And when we read these accounts, we realized that the visual metaphors were so strong and that we could create a 24-hour cycle in the modern yeshiva in 4.5 minutes. And we did it by creating a painted animation of a very special kind. And so our 24-hour story starts with a young man coming to the yeshiva, and when inside the yeshiva, and this was a modern private yeshiva, it wasn't sponsored by the community, we cast live actors, we painted them, we filmed them in a green room, we created a scenography inside, in the computer basically, we put the two things together, and we made the film, and then we projected the film on canvas, and then we reshot the film so that it would have the quality of a painting that's come to life. So it was our intention to basically take the genre of a 19th century painting as the starting point and to tell the story of 24 hours through the quotations from a particular autobiography. And similarly, we also animate the big story of industrialization, urbanization, social mobility, demographic expansion through personal stories taken from memoirs and autobiographies, which are really amazing in this period because they not only communicate change, they communicate the experience of change and most of all, the consciousness of change. And that's what we're trying to get at. So that's, to my way of thinking, whether you call that intangible heritage or not, it's a way of getting at something intangible and trying to give it some kind of graphic and material expression. Now, where the issue of telos and time really, I would say, become critical is in the interwar years. Because there are probably several, but there are two main paradigms for thinking about the 1920s and 30s. Celia Heller, a sociologist, she titled her book about this period, On the Edge of Destruction. In other words, it's through the lens of the Holocaust. And there are others, historians, who've said that despite economic hardship, despite rising anti-Semitism, this was a period that could be considered a second golden age, a period of political vibrancy, cultural creativity, huge investment in youth. And so it's very important for us that when visitors are visiting, and we've used the scenography of a street with 2 levels, when visitors are visiting this gallery, that they don't have the feeling that, oh, the Holocaust is coming, the Holocaust is coming. And so it's here that it's extremely important to keep visitors in the moment of the story, a story of political vibrancy, with a timeline that chronicles in this short period, it's only 2 decades, of independent Poland, the Second Polish Republic, that chronicles key events, that communicates cultural creativity and vibrancy in the Yiddish language, but also in the Polish language, that includes music, sound, it includes much that is not expressed in the form of a material object. Growing up, the whole sequence, and here is really, we have wonderful material. There were 3 autobiography contests for Jewish youth in the 1930s, and we used them to narrate the whole process of growing up. And so it's really driven by these autobiographical materials and daily life across the length and breadth of the country. And when you come to the end of that street, when you're looking down the street, you don't actually see what's coming next until you turn the corner. What you see on the right, are people looking up. And you don't know, when you're on the street, looking down the street, and you see them looking up, you don't know what they're looking up at. As it turns out, it's the American ambassador and his staff standing outside the American embassy, getting ready to evacuate because the Germans have just invaded. September 1st, 1939. You turn the corner and you see bombs falling on Warsaw. Now, the idea of time, of staying in the present moment, becomes absolutely I would say it's at its most crucial is in the Holocaust Gallery itself and what the implications are. So in the Holocaust Gallery, we have an extraordinary opportunity. So the first thing is we keep the story completely within the borders of occupied Poland. That is to say, we look at what happened within occupied Poland, and we look from occupied Poland out to what was happening in Europe. But we don't start in 1933, we start in 1939, September 1st. We don't start with the rise of Hitler, because that for us is an interwar year story. It's a story of the 30s, of the 20s and 30s. But when we're here in the moment that the Germans invade Poland and that the Soviets then occupy the other part of Poland. And we begin with the story of separation and isolation. And when we move to the ultimate form of isolation, the ghetto, we also use a principle we call pars pro toto, a part for the whole. And because we're a site-specific museum, because we're sitting on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, we use the Warsaw Ghetto as the part for the whole, which is to say, of trying to understand what the ghetto was like and how it functioned. But we have a very special opportunity, and here you can see it. On the right, you have Adam Chernyakov, who was the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish council that the Germans created to run the ghetto and carry out their orders. And he kept a diary in Polish. And on the left, we have Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a labor Zionist and historian before the war. He kept a diary in Yiddish. And this is a story that we tell in two voices. So we have quotes from their diaries, and those two different voices, point, counterpoint, work all the way through the presentation of the Warsaw Ghetto. And we have something very, very extraordinary, and that is that Emanuel Ringelblum established a secret archive in the Warsaw Ghetto to collect everything that could document what was actually going on. Ration tickets, tram tickets, reports, letters, diaries, every conceivable material. And he and his team, they were planning that when the war would end, they would be back in normal life, that they would write a book based on the archive. But during the Great Deportation in the summer of 1943, when 300,000 Jews were deported from the ghetto to Treblinka, they realized that they weren't going to survive. And so they packed that archive into tin boxes and milk cans, and they buried it in 3 places. And right after the war, those few people who survived and knew where they were buried, in the rubble of the ghetto, they actually found the materials and they excavated them. And we've created this presentation from that material. And so this is a very unusual presentation because there are no video survivor testimonies that have been made after the war, nothing from the Spielberg archive. Ordinarily in a Holocaust museum, you have video testimonies from survivors, but those are 40, 50, 60, 70 years after the event. And what we try to do is to only use material that was created on the spot, in the moment, with no knowledge of what would happen next. And that's our way of we ask our visitors, bracket what you know, put yourself in the shoes of the people in the period, and of what they could know, what they did know, and how they responded to a kind of, I would say, gradually becoming aware. So as in a sense, the people whose story we tell become more aware, we gradually lift the curtain so that by the end of the gallery, visitors get the whole picture. And so that's a very, very, very particular way of narrating, and it's very, very important to our approach. And of course, this includes the story of Polish-Jewish relations during the war as well. And we come finally to the post-war years period. And the post-war years period is actually, on the one hand, it's a devastating period, even though after 1989 we see a renewal of Jewish life in Poland. But fundamentally, Poland was, certainly Warsaw was 80% destroyed, many other cities also. And Jews, those who survived, about 10% of the 3,300,000 Jews survived, and about 240,000 of them were in Poland immediately after the war. Most of them were saved, in fact, by deportation to the Soviet Union. And they came back to a destroyed world. And the fundamental question they asked was whether to stay or to leave. And that's the way in which we've organized the story in space, because we use the principle of narrative space, and we try to use the space in a way that will also tell the story. So the story of staying and leaving, the violence in the immediate post-war years, which is a very painful story. Between 1945 and 1948, more than half of the Jews in Poland at that time, these Holocaust survivors, actually left Poland. And the Jewish life in Poland under communism is a very important story for the side of the gallery that focuses on those who stayed. And then 1968, there was an anti-Semitic campaign, and we present here the last major wave, which is about 13,000 Jews who left and about 10,000 who stayed. And considering that we had 3,300,000 Jews in 1939, you can imagine what this means to have this museum here today. And of course, I think what's really critically important is the period after 1989, the fall of communism, and the renewal of Jewish life on a small scale, and also enormous Jewish presence in Polish consciousness to a degree that I think is really unparalleled in Europe. And that's something else that we could also discuss. And so we, as I say, in about the first week, end of the first week of November, we hope to be able to welcome our millionth visitor. And those who ask us, who is our audience? And my answer is our audience are people between the ages of 14 and 28, more or less, which is the transformative generation. They're expecting a Jewish audience, a Polish audience, but no, we're really interested in what we call the transformative generation, and they are coming, and we have quite a steep hill to climb because the groups of young people who come generally come to commemorate the Holocaust only, and we would like to enlarge their perspective and for them to understand that, in fact, the sense of loss will be even deeper if they understand not only the loss of 3 million Polish Jews, 6 million Jews, including those in the rest of Europe, but also that these people created an incredible world that was really lost with them, and that this 1,000-year story is a very, very important part of that commemoration. And at the same time, there is a renewal of Jewish life, and we would also like for them to experience that as well. And so I really do hope that your bags are packed. You're about to call your agent and make your way to Warsaw to visit Polin Museum, and I would love to be there to welcome you.